Healthcare is too expensive. Employers are offsetting costs onto their employees. Who will make health benefits affordable for hardworking Americans and their families? You will. This is the Empowering Plans Podcast, a show dedicated to helping you once again emphasize the benefit in benefit plan. Now prepare to learn, plan, save, and protect with the FIA Group.
Welcome to another episode of Empowering Plans. Today you have myself, Kelly Dempsey, along with Kevin Brady to talk about a really fun topic that's not the NSA or mental health parity. We purposely wanted to bring you guys something else because we know that that's been the hot topics for the last who knows how long. So we were racking our brains and we actually got a question from one of our clients and a suggestion to talk about the break-in service and rehired rules under the Affordable Care Act, specifically under the employer mandate or the shared employer responsibility provisions. So I will give a quick disclaimer on this one that, like any of our other terminology in the industry, sometimes we use words interchangeably, but that can get confusing because some of the titles of the rules are the same words. So we will try to be mindful of that, but just be aware that some of these words are kind of interchangeable, but there are separate and distinct rules for break-in service versus rehire. Those are two different rules under this umbrella. So again, the original rule here for the employer mandate was obviously to require employers to offer coverage to full-time employees. The employer mandate changed a lot of things, including the hours of service requirement of what employers consider a full-time employee. And then we had to build in some kind of fail-safes because, I think the government was very wary of how they were setting this up, and they were aware that there's always ways to kind of move around things. So they created this rehire and break-in service rules to kind of prevent employers from skirting the rules by hiring and firing employees without ever triggering that offer of coverage. So if they kept this kind of rotating door of employees or keeping people coming in and out, they wouldn't have to offer coverage. So obviously the rules, that's very contradictory to what the employer mandate stood for at the beginning. So this rule is always kind of been seen as a thorn in the side of plan administrators and claims administrators, especially if the employer isn't great at communicating with the claims administrator about when these breaks are happening, when these employees are coming and going. So it plays into that whole eligibility concept. That eligibility can be tricky, especially if you have employers that are in a high turnover industry, like the restaurant industry, fast food, things of those nature. So again, when we're thinking about these, we're talking about employees who either go on leave or who are furloughed, laid off, or terminated from employment. All of those can kind of come into play depending on how the employer does it. So there's always going to be that it depends. I know you guys hate when the attorneys say that, but Kevin and I both say that a lot, and don't hate us for it. So again, this also plays into continuation of coverage issues and when somebody is out and when they should have coverage or when they shouldn't have coverage. So there's just a lot of things to consider, and I realize that was a really long intro. So I'm going to turn it over to Kevin to do a quick recap of when the break-in service and rehire rules apply.
All right, well, I'll do my best to avoid an it depends anywhere throughout this, just because I don't want to double down and, keep it going. So I think the first thing to think about is just like, when do these rules apply? So when we're thinking about the employer mandate, one of the big considerations there is an applicable large employer or a not an applicable large employer. So usually an applicable large employer or an ALE is going to be an employer that generally has, 50 full-time or full-time equivalent employees or more. And those employers are going to be subject to the employer mandate. So when we're thinking about, the break-in service and rehire rules, these kind of things, that's really when, those ACA employer mandate rules are going to apply, would be for the ALEs. So thinking about employers that are not ALEs, there's not going to be specific employer mandate rules regarding any kind of rehire, break-in service provisions within the document that, have to be accounted for from a compliance standpoint, thinking about the ACA. But, still, it's always going to be important to outline, what's going to happen in that situation for non-ALEs. You're always going to want to outline somebody is terminated and then rehired beyond a certain date, whatever it might be. It's always important to, outline that within the document, just because you want to avoid any kind of stop loss issues or eligibility issues, all those kind of things. And making sure that those items are outlined in the plan document is always going to be important.
And ERISA actually requires that.
Oh.
ERISA SPD requirements say that you have to include the provisions of eligibility. I'd read the rules directly to you, but then you might fall asleep. So we'll skip that. But it is also an ERISA requirement, which is why even if the ACA says that there's no specific requirement to document all this stuff in the plan document, it's a good idea. Sorry, Kevin.
No, great. Yeah, no, stole my thunder, but that's good. Yeah, it's always good. But then turning over to applicable large employers here, this is really where, the specific rules that we're going to be talking about today come into play. And, as Kelly mentioned, with the employer mandate, this is something that the government was thinking about, how do we protect employees and make sure that there's no kind of funny business going on, and making sure that especially those that are working for applicable large employers are protected. So turning to kind of the next question is, really, what are the rules for the ALEs, for applicable large employers? What needs to happen? So I think it's really important to understand some of the terminology here too. The big distinction here is between treating employees as continuing employees or new employees. So when we're thinking about continuing employees, that's going to be someone who was, full-time, eligible for benefits, prior to their termination event, and then they're going to be rehired within 13 weeks, unless the rule of parity applies, which Kelly will talk about. But that's really what you're thinking about here is, somebody that, had benefits or was, full-time, and they were, rehired within that 13-week range. And then when we're talking about new employees, in the rehire context at least, it's going to be employees that are rehired after that 13-week period. And those individuals can be subject to additional waiting periods, eligibility criteria, and et cetera. So let's just dive into the rules here. Thinking about the, what we'll call just the 13-week, 13 or 26-week rule, the main rule to think about here is that an employee must be treated as a continuing employee if they are rehired after a break in service of less than 13 weeks. And that's going to be 26 weeks for an educational institution, colleges, et cetera, unless we're talking about the rule of parity. So generally, if any employee is rehired before that 13-week mark, then the employee must be treated as a continuing employee. And that means that they can't be subject to any kind of additional waiting period or anything like that. So what do employers have to do if an individual is a continuing employee? So when you're thinking about that, it really just means that there has to be an offer of coverage on the first day that the employee is rehired, eligible for coverage there, or as soon as administratively practicable, which often means just the first of the month following rehire. So that's really, the continuing employee piece is, anybody that was rehired within that 13-week period, 26 weeks for educational institutions, we have to treat them as if, almost like they never left, right? They're not a new employee necessarily. They're continuing on, no additional waiting periods, no new requirements they have to fulfill, anything like that. But the next thing here is going to be, what happens if they're rehired after that, 13-week period. So an employer can treat an employee as a new hire if they are rehired after a break in service of that 13-week period or more. So the big thing there is think about an employer may treat an employee as a new hire. They're not required to do so. So an employer has the discretion, if they want to treat all their rehired employees as continuing employees. They don't have to subject them to new waiting periods, anything like that. They can be as generous as they want. So just to give out some examples here, an employer wants to be super generous and doesn't want to impose any new waiting periods on rehired employees. They can just, add language to their plan document indicating that all employees that, were terminated and rehired, they were, previously eligible for benefits, whatever the criteria might be, that they'll be eligible for coverage immediately and that there's no new waiting period, anything like that. And then you can kind of just compare that against an employer that, wants to kind of be in line with the rules there. And then what they can do, as long as, that the individual didn't log an hour of service within the 13 weeks, or as long as they were rehired after that 13-week period, you can treat them as a new employee and you can impose kind of any of that eligibility criteria that you want. So I know it's a lot and it can be kind of hard to follow some of those times, but hopefully that made sense. And really the big distinction there is between, that 13-week rule and, treating employees as either continuing or new employees. So I'll throw it over to Kelly to talk about, something super easy, not complex at all, not hard to explain. And that's going to be the rule of parity, which just likes to turn everything upside down where we're talking about the break-in service rules.
For sure. And I will say that, for those clients that have talked to me on the phone about these things, when it comes to ERISA and the ACA generally set a floor. Employers are allowed to be more generous than what that floor is. They can go over it. Whereas the IRS rules tend to set a ceiling, and the IRS says you can do this, but you can't do more than this. So that's always an important thing that I like to throw out there because it's kind of how we like to think about it. But with the rule of parity, this is an extra rule that was kind of an extra bonus for employers. Again, those employers that have a high rate of turnover, usually like the restaurant industries, fast food, even just regular restaurants, that they wanted to have some protection for employees that tend to come and go on a very frequent basis. So the rule of parity specifically says that if the period measured of the employee works, if they work at least 4 consecutive weeks, and then they go longer than that without an hour of service, that the employee can be treated as a new employee all over again. So it's easier to articulate this in an actual example. So say the employee worked for 5 weeks, which is greater than the minimum requirement of 4 weeks. So employee worked for 5 weeks, was gone for 6 weeks, and then wants to come back. If the employer is using the rule of parity and it's outlined in their SPD, they can say, sorry about your luck, you're a new hire all over again, and you got to go back to the beginning. So again, it's that concept of if they were gone longer than they worked originally, you can treat them as a new hire. It just has to be a minimum of 4 weeks. And then obviously they can't hit that 13-week threshold because when they hit 13 weeks, you can treat them as a new hire anyway. So again, it's an extra layer of protection for employers that have a high turnover. So if their absence from work is greater than the amount of time that they actually worked prior to the absence, you can treat them as a new hire. So again, it's a little confusing, it's a little wonky, but it's definitely there to help employers so that employers can do that. And again, make sure it's in the plan document. If you want to use it, it needs to be in the plan document.
Not to mention, they probably could have used a different word than parity, just because like we have mental health parity, we've got parity all over the place. I just feel like maybe,
Right.
let's use some different terminology.
Right. Right. And that happens a lot. We've got the covered entity under HIPAA, then you've got a covered entity under Section 1557. It all gets very confusing. There in the introduction, we talked about the rehire versus break-in service and how these are two separate and distinct rules. So the rehire rules are really for employees that again have either terminated employment and then are coming back, and this applies both to the monthly and the look back measurement methods. So it doesn't matter which measurement method you're using. If you're an applicable large employer, the rehire rules will apply to both look back and monthly measurement methods. So that's an important thing to know. Then we've got the break-in service rules, which get a little bit more confusing, but the break-in service rules are for continuing employees, and this applies only when the employer uses the look back measurement method, and it's specifically related to how you calculate to determine if somebody is still eligible to be a full-time employee when there is some sort of break-in service. And that break-in service is generally tied to a FMLA leave, a military leave under USERRA, some sort of jury duty that, I've never been on a jury duty that's lasted really long, but, if you've got a really juicy case, maybe it would be, and maybe they're gone for a long time. But those break-in service rules are simply really associated to how you calculate whether or not somebody is still a full-time employee and whether or not they get to continue coverage through all of their different measurement periods. So again, it can be a little bit goofy, a little bit wonky, but it's important to distinguish these rehire rules from the break-in service because they serve two totally separate purposes. And with that, I know we've already talked about it a little bit, but Kevin will do a quick recap on the plan language piece and why plan language is so important here. And the only other thing that I'll say before I turn it back over to Kevin is that when it comes to the determinations, and again, this is something that you've probably heard both of us say, and we're going to sound like broken records, but when it comes to these determinations, every employee situation should be looked at on a case-by-case basis because the facts of the situation are going to change the application of the rules. So it's very, very important that if you have a specific individual employee, you look at their individual situation and you map it out according to how it's going to apply to that employee. And you don't try to draw these broad sweeping strokes and rules to all the different individuals. The same rules apply, but again, it's always going to depend. Like I said, when I referenced the break-in service rules, it could be FMLA, it could be USERRA, it could be jury duty. So it's going to apply differently for different individuals. And that's important. And with that, I promise I will stop talking and I'll turn it back over to Kevin.
No, much appreciated. Yeah, I think really just what the question is what language do I have to put in the plan document, to outline this stuff essentially? And, the answer to that is, it depends on really what you're looking at. So if you look at the ACA, the ACA doesn't necessarily impose any specific PD requirements. It doesn't state, affirmatively that all of this stuff needs to be outlined with the plan document and all that stuff. But, as you mentioned earlier, and it's a really good point, is just that part of ERISA's required SPD contents are that, plans are required to include provisions that are related to the eligibility for individuals to participate in the plan. So when we're thinking about, plan language, obviously you can just go down the rabbit hole of, what do I need to look at between the ACA, ERISA, HIPAA, Medicare Secondary Care Act, whatever it might be. There's a long list of things you have to think about. So, while this is mainly a ACA imposed requirement on plans, when we're thinking about the plan document itself, it's really where we're gonna have to look at ERISA to kind of spell out that we do need to include this information. It's important from that respect, but it's also important, just so it can mitigate any potential, issues later on, right? So obviously eligibility is super important, from a claim standpoint, whether something's payable, whether someone's eligible, everything like that. So, having this stuff in the document, having it clearly outlined is always going to help when you're thinking about, eligibility for individuals, just from a plan administration perspective. Then obviously you want to mitigate and avoid any kind of, stop loss issues down the road potentially. So always important to include this stuff in the plan document itself, whether that's an ALE or not an ALE, whether it's, 13 weeks or 26 weeks, all that stuff should be outlined with the plan, be as, thorough as possible as far as, who's going to be eligible for coverage, when that's going to happen, and so on and so forth. So yeah, I think that pretty much wraps up our conversation regarding the break-in service and the rehire rules. Yep, throw it back over to Kelly.
Yeah, I want to just throw out one thing because we've talked about this with some of our other services before, but when it comes to, this detailed eligibility stuff, some employers just say it's too much to put in the plan document. I want to have a separate policy, and that's okay as long as when you sign up for stop loss, you give them a copy of that policy and they'll accept it as a separate document. And again, I know we probably sound like broken records because I feel like we say that all the time, but it's super important. Generally stop loss will look at the four corners of the plan document, and if it's not in there, they won't consider it. So if it's in a wrap document, if it's in an employer, handbook, if it's in a totally separate policy, you just have to make sure that all your entities are on the same page about where your governing documents and language are, and that they're willing to accept that. And that was just my last little piece that I couldn't help myself.
No, that's good. That's really great insight. And obviously that's just, you want to protect the plan, you want to protect the plan participants. So, it's really important to make sure all of that is known and it's out there and that everyone's on the same page when it comes to that stuff. So with that, coming from the Canton office, I think we can sign off.
Yeah.
It's great seeing you guys.
Thanks for joining us.